In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. You have heard this phrase countless times if you know anything about Warhammer 40,000, but let me tell you about the beings for whom this statement is most terrifyingly true. Not the genetically enhanced space marines who stride across battlefields like demigods. Not the tech priests of Mars with their blessed machines. Not even the Sisters of Battle with their unshakable faith. No, I am talking about the ordinary men and women of the Astra Militarum, known to most simply as the Imperial Guard. These are the true backbone of the Imperium of Man. These are the souls who stand between humanity and extinction, with nothing but a laser gun, a prayer, and orders to hold the line no matter the cost. These are the Guardsmen, and their existence is a horror that most citizens of the Imperium will never comprehend. Before we begin this journey into one of the most brutal military forces ever conceived, I want to know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. Are you settling in for the evening, preparing for sleep? Perhaps you are starting your day, or maybe you are passing time during a commute. Whatever your circumstances, I hope you are comfortable, because the Guardsmen we will discuss today knew precious little comfort in their short, brutal lives. The Imperium of Man spans 1,000,000 worlds, possibly more. The exact number is unknown even to the vast bureaucracies that attempt to catalogue and control it all. Across this incomprehensible expanse of space, humanity clings to existence, beset on all sides by horrors that would drive lesser civilizations to extinction in a matter of years. The Xenos races that hunger for human worlds are beyond counting. The forces of chaos that pour from the warp seek to corrupt and destroy everything the Emperor built. Rebellion and heresy bloom like toxic flowers on worlds that have gone too long without proper supervision. Against all of this stands the Astra Militarum, the largest military force in human history. The scale of this organization defies comprehension. It has been said that if every guardsman in active service were to form up in a single column, it would stretch from Holy Terror to Armageddon. Every single year, trillions of new recruits are tithed into service. Every single day, millions die in conflicts scattered across the galaxy. The Department Munitorum, the vast bureaucratic machine responsible for organizing and supplying the Imperial Guard, cannot provide an accurate count of how many guardsmen currently serve. The lists of new recruits and the tolls of casualties can run into the millions in a single day, and the record keepers simply cannot keep pace. This is the grinding reality of warfare in the 41st millennium. It is not glorious. It is not heroic in the way that propaganda posters would have you believe. It is industrial-scale death, where human beings are measured not as individuals but as units of force to be expended in pursuit of objectives. The commanders who move regiments across star maps think in terms of acceptable casualty rates and strategic assets. They do not think about the young man from a farming world who will die screaming in a trench on a planet whose name he cannot pronounce, killed by a creature he was never trained to fight. The Astra Militarum is often called the Hammer of the Emperor, a blunt instrument of overwhelming force that crushes the enemies of mankind through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. In contrast, the Space Marines are referred to as the Scalpel of the Emperor, precise surgical strikes carried out by the finest warriors humanity can create. But here is the truth that every Imperial citizen learns. Space Marines win battles, but the Imperial Guard wins wars. Where 1,000 Space Marines might turn the tide of a single engagement, It takes millions upon millions of guardsmen to hold territory, to garrison conquered worlds, to form the vast supply chains that keep the Imperium functioning, and to die in numbers that allow those precious few Space Marines to accomplish their objectives. Let me put this in perspective for you. The entirety of the Adeptus Astartes, all of the Space Marine chapters combined, numbers perhaps 1 million warriors at any given time. This sounds impressive until you realize that 1 million Space Marines must protect 1 million worlds. There are fewer Space Marines than there are planets in the Imperium. The math is simple and brutal. If the Imperium relied solely on Space Marines, humanity would have fallen 10,000 years ago. The Imperial Guard exists because humanity needs soldiers who can be everywhere at once. They need bodies to throw at problems until those problems are buried under corpses. They need men and women willing to stand in trenches and face down alien horrors with nothing but faith in the Emperor and fear of the Commissar at their back. They need an organization so vast that losing entire regiments, tens of thousands of soldiers at a time, is considered an acceptable cost of doing business. This is the force we are discussing today. Not an elite fighting force of chosen warriors, but a vast machine that consumes human lives as fuel and produces victories measured in devastated worlds and casualty reports that stretch for pages. Every guardsman who enters service knows on some level that they are expendable. Every officer who gives orders knows that those orders will result in deaths. Every bureaucrat who processes requisition forms knows that each number on those forms represents a human being who will likely never see their home again. And yet, they serve, they fight, they die. Because in the Imperium of Man there is no choice. Because faith in the Emperor demands sacrifice. Because the alternative is extinction, and even a life of suffering and terror is preferable to the death of humanity itself. This is the paradox at the heart of the Imperial Guard. They are victims and heroes, slaves and saviors, expendable and irreplaceable all at once. The Imperial tithe and recruitment. Every world in the Imperium must pay the Imperial tithe. This is not a request or a negotiation. It is an absolute requirement, enforced by the full might of the Imperium's bureaucracy, and, when necessary, by force. The tithe takes many forms depending on the world in question. Forge worlds provide weapons and war machines. Agri-worlds provide food to feed the uncountable billions who serve the Imperium. Hive worlds provide manufactured goods and raw materials. And then there are the worlds that provide the most precious resource of all, human beings. The tithe of men and women for the Imperial Guard is determined by a complex calculation performed by the Adeptus Administratum. They consider the world's population, its strategic importance, its existing military commitments, and a dozen other factors that vary from sector to sector. Some worlds might be required to provide a single regiment every decade. Others, particularly the fortress worlds that exist in a constant state of military readiness, might raise dozens of regiments every year. The variation is enormous, but the requirement is absolute. Every world must provide soldiers when called upon to do so. The process of recruitment varies dramatically depending on the world in question. Some planets maintain standing armies from which guard regiments are drawn. Others use a conscription system, taking young men and women of a certain age and shipping them off to war whether they wish to go or not. A few worlds use volunteer systems. though the definition of volunteer can be rather flexible when commissars are involved in the recruitment process. On militant fortress worlds like Cadia, every citizen is trained from childhood to be a soldier. Boys and girls learn to field strip and maintain a laser gun before they learn to read. They spend their childhoods drilling in formation and learning tactics. By the time they reach military age, they are already more capable soldiers than the PDF forces of many other worlds. When Cadia raised regiments for the Imperial Guard, it was drawing from a population that had been preparing for war since birth. The Cadian shock troops were rightfully considered among the finest conventional forces in the entire Imperium, and their training regimen was copied by countless other worlds, attempting to improve their own military capabilities. But Cadia was exceptional. Most worlds do not have the luxury or the threat level that would justify turning their entire society into a war machine. For the average Imperial world, the tithe comes as a disruption to normal life, a demand from distant terror that must be met regardless of the cost. Administratum officials arrive with quotas and deadlines. Local planetary governors must then determine how to meet those quotas. Sometimes, the PDF forms the backbone of a new guard regiment. The planetary defense forces that garrison every Imperial world are supposed to be trained soldiers, though the quality of that training can vary wildly. A PDF veteran from a world that has seen actual combat might be a capable soldier, hardened by experience and ready for the rigours of guard service. A PDF soldier from a peaceful agri-world might have spent his entire service standing guard at food processing facilities, never firing his weapon outside of annual qualification drills. Both will find themselves in guard regiments, and one will die much faster than the other. Other times, the tithe takes the young. Provincial officials go through population registries and select individuals based on age, physical fitness, or sometimes nothing more than bad luck. Imagine being 17 years old, working on your family's farm or in a factory, when administratum officials arrive with your conscription notice. You have perhaps a few weeks to say goodbye to everything and everyone you have ever known. Then you are loaded onto a transport with hundreds or thousands of others from your world, and you are taken away. The journey to your training depot might take weeks or months, depending on the vagaries of warp travel. During this time, you begin to understand the first terrible truth of service in the Imperial Guard. You will never see your home again. This is not an exaggeration or a figure of speech. The Imperium's policy on guard service is explicit. Once a regiment is raised and deployed, it does not return to its homeworld. The reasoning is practical from a strategic standpoint. Guard regiments are deployed where they are needed, and that need does not align with sending them home. More cynically, the Imperium learned during the Horus Heresy that soldiers with strong ties to their homeworlds could be turned against the Imperium if their world rebelled. Better to deploy regiments far from home, where they have no conflicting loyalties. This policy creates a unique psychological burden. Every guardsman must come to terms with the fact that they have been severed from their previous life completely. The farm they grew up on, the city streets they walked, the people they loved, all of it is gone. They might live for decades in guard service, but they will never walk those familiar paths again. Home becomes a fading memory, growing hazier with each passing year, until even the faces of loved ones begin to blur in recollection. The tithe does not discriminate by gender, though the specifics vary by world. Some planets have cultural traditions that affect how women serve, and some regiments are exclusively male or exclusively female as a result. The Valhallan Ice Warriors, for instance, have many mixed-gender regiments, as the brutal environment of their homeworld has long since burned away any notion that survival is determined by gender. Other worlds might field all-female regiments or integrate women into existing formations. The Imperium cares only that its tithe is met, not about the specific composition of the regiments raised. For criminals and undesirables, guard service can be an alternative to execution or penal servitude. Penal legions draw their ranks from the convicted, the desperate, and those whom the Imperium wishes to punish but still finds useful. These units are treated as expendable even by guard standards, used for the most suicidal assaults and the most dangerous missions. Service in a penal legion is often a death sentence with extra steps, but it at least offers the possibility of redemption through service to the Emperor. Some penal legionnaires earn their way back to regular guard service through exceptional acts of courage or survival. Most simply die slightly more quickly than they would have in a regular regiment. The indentured and the enslaved also find their way into guard ranks. Some worlds practice forms of bondage that the Imperium tolerates, as long as they do not interfere with productivity and tithe requirements. When such worlds raise regiments, they might include significant numbers of bonded labourers who are being elevated to military service. These soldiers often have even less choice than regular conscripts, moving from one form of servitude to another. They are given laser guns and told to fight, and if they die in service, at least they die serving the Emperor instead of breaking rocks in a quarry or slaving in a factory. Once recruited, the soldiers are organized into regiments. The regiment is the fundamental unit of the Imperial Guard, and understanding its structure is essential to understanding how the Guard functions. A regiment typically consists of several thousand soldiers, though the exact number varies wildly depending on the world raising it and the type of regiment being formed. Infantry regiments tend to be larger, while specialist formations like armoured regiments or artillery regiments are smaller in personnel count but require more support and equipment. Each regiment is supposed to be self-contained, possessing its own command structure, support services, and identity. They carry the name of their homeworld with pride, identifying themselves as Cadians or Valhallans, or whatever their origin might be. This identity is important because it is all they have left of home. The colours they wear, the traditions they maintain, the particular ways they organise and fight, these become sacred to soldiers who will never see their birthworld again. Regiments are not supposed to be reinforced with soldiers from other worlds. This is another lesson learned from the Horus heresy. By keeping regiments homogeneous, the Imperium limits the potential for rebellion to spread. If a regiment turns traitor, it is just one regiment, composed of soldiers from one world. They cannot easily join with other regiments or spread their heresy to soldiers from different cultures. Similarly, if a world rebels, its regiments in the field are isolated, far from home and unable to return to aid the rebellion. The system is designed to prevent exactly the kind of large-scale coordination that made the Horus heresy so devastating. This policy has consequences for the long-term survival of regiments. Battle depletes their ranks. Casualties accumulate. Without reinforcements from their homeworld, which might be months or years away by warp travel, regiments slowly bleed to death. When a regiment is reduced below effective strength, It might be combined with other regiments from the same world if any are available. Otherwise, it is simply disbanded, its survivors distributed to other formations or, in rare cases, granted garrison duties on the world they last fought to defend. The process of being recruited into the Imperial Guard is traumatic by design. It must break down the individual's sense of self and rebuild them as a soldier who will follow orders without question. Different worlds have different methods of achieving this, but the result is always the same: the creation of someone who can stand in a trench and watch horrors approach while holding their position, because to run would be to face the Commissar's bolt pistol. Training begins immediately, often during the journey to the training depot. Recruits are taught the basics of military discipline, learning to march in formation, to maintain their equipment, and to obey orders instantly. They are indoctrinated with imperial cult theology, learning the prayers and catechisms that will sustain them when facing the galaxy's nightmares. They are told that service to the Emperor is the highest calling a human can aspire to, that death in his name is glorious, and that the enemies they will face are worthy only of extermination. The lucky ones receive months of training before deployment. They learn to shoot with reasonable accuracy, to perform basic small unit tactics, to dig proper fighting positions, and to provide first aid to wounded comrades. They become familiar with the equipment they will use and the procedures they must follow. They form bonds with their fellow recruits, creating the cohesion that will keep them fighting when every instinct screams at them to run. The unlucky ones receive mere weeks of training, or even days in the most desperate circumstances. When the Imperium needs bodies to throw at a problem immediately, training becomes abbreviated to the bare minimum. These soldiers are taught which end of the lace gun to point at the enemy, given a brief overview of Imperial doctrine, and shipped to the front lines knowing that they are likely to die before they fully understand what is happening to them. Regardless of the training duration, every guardsman receives one piece of equipment that is absolutely mandatory: the Imperial Infantryman's uplifting primer. This small handbook is supposed to contain everything a guardsman needs to know about their duties, their equipment, and the enemies they will face. In reality, it is a mixture of useful information, propaganda, and outright lies. It tells guardsmen that their flak armor will protect them from enemy fire when it barely stops stubber rounds. It describes orcs as slow and stupid creatures when they are in fact terrifyingly fast and possess a brutal cunning. It provides tactical advice that might work against human enemies, but is suicidally inadequate against most of the galaxy's actual threats. But the primer serves its true purpose. It provides comfort. When a guardsman is cowering in a shell crater, listening to the screams of the dying and the roar of weapons they do not understand, they can pull out their primer and remind themselves that the Imperium has faced these enemies before and prevailed. The words might be lies, but they are necessary lies, because the truth would break too many soldiers before they ever reached the battlefield. This, then, is how the Imperial Guard creates soldiers. They take young men and women from a million worlds, tear them away from everything they know, subject them to brutal training and indoctrination, and then ship them across the galaxy to fight and die in the Emperor's name. It is not a kind process. It is not a fair process, but it is the process that has sustained the Imperium for 10,000 years, and it will continue for as long as humanity survives in this hostile universe. Training and indoctrination. The training regimen for Imperial Guard recruits is as varied as the million worlds that provide them. There is no single standard, no universal curriculum that every guardsman follows. This decentralization is both a strength and a weakness. It allows worlds to train soldiers according to their own martial traditions and in preparation for the specific threats they face. But it also means that the quality of training can vary dramatically from regiment to regiment. On fortress worlds like Cadia, training was a lifelong process. Children as young as 4 or 5 years old would begin learning basic military discipline. By the age of 10, they could field strip and reassemble a lasgun in complete darkness. Their entire childhood was structured around eventual military service, with academic education taking a back seat to tactical training and physical conditioning. Every Cadian adult was expected to be capable of fighting at a moment's notice, and the regiments raised from Cadia reflected this universal militarization. Even though Cadia has fallen to the 13th Black Crusade, its traditions continue among the scattered survivors and the countless worlds that modelled their own militaries after the Cadian example. The Death Corps of Krieg takes a different approach, one that reflects the grim culture of their devastated homeworld. Krieg children are raised in underground hive cities, sheltered from the radioactive wastelands that cover their planet's surface. From the moment they can understand speech, they are taught that they exist to atone for their world's ancient rebellion through death in service to the Emperor. Krieg training is less about creating skilled soldiers and more about creating fanatical ones. They learn to obey orders without question, to advance into enemy fire without flinching, and to view their own lives as worthless except as currency to purchase victory for the Imperium. A Death Corps guardsman will walk through a minefield if ordered to do so, secure in the knowledge that their death will serve the Emperor's purpose. Catachan jungle fighters undergo training that would kill soldiers from softer worlds. Catachan is a death world, a planet so hostile that its flora and fauna kill more of its human inhabitants than any Xenos threat. Children learn to survive in the jungle or they die, simple as that. By the time they reach military age, Catachans are already survivors of challenges that would daunt veteran soldiers from other worlds. Their training focuses on small unit tactics, ambush warfare, and the use of their legendary combat knives. A Catachan guardsman is worth 5 soldiers from a civilized world in close-quarters combat, and they know it. They carry themselves with a swagger that other regiments find insufferable, but that swagger is earned through survival in one of the galaxy's most dangerous environments. For the vast majority of guardsmen, training falls somewhere between these extremes. 4 to 6 months is typical for a newly raised regiment, though this can be shortened drastically if the strategic situation demands immediate deployment. The focus is on creating soldiers who can follow basic orders, maintain their equipment, and fight as part of a unit. Individual skills are less important than collective cohesion. The Guard wins through mass and coordination, not through individual heroics. The training process begins with breaking down the recruit's civilian identity. Different methods are used depending on cultural context, but the goal is always the same: to create someone who thinks of themselves as a soldier first and an individual second. Drill instructors, often veterans with years of frontline experience, subject recruits to constant physical and psychological pressure. Sleep deprivation, endless repetitions of basic tasks, and harsh discipline for even minor infractions are standard tools of the trade. Physical conditioning builds strength and endurance, preparing bodies for the rigors of extended campaigning. Recruits learn to march for hours while carrying full kit. They practice digging fighting positions, learning to use the entrenching tool that will become one of their most important pieces of equipment. They run obstacle courses designed to simulate battlefield conditions. They learn to function while exhausted, hungry, and afraid, because those will be the conditions under which they fight. Weapons training is intensive but often limited by available ammunition and resources. The lasgun is the standard weapon of the Imperial Guard, and every guardsman must achieve basic proficiency with it. They learn its operation, maintenance, and basic marksmanship. More advanced techniques like shooting while moving or engaging targets at extreme range might be taught to specialist formations, but most guardsmen receive only fundamental training. The Imperium's philosophy is that massed lasfire is more effective than individual marksmanship anyway, so training focuses on getting large numbers of soldiers to shoot in the same general direction, rather than creating expert marksmen. Specialist weapons require specialist training. Heavy weapons teams learn to operate and maintain auto-cannons, lascannons, missile launchers, and other crew-served weapons. These soldiers often receive significantly more training than standard infantry because the Imperium has invested more resources in their equipment and needs them to be effective with it. Similarly, soldiers assigned to operate vehicles receive technical training appropriate to their role, though the complexity and duration of this training varies wildly depending on the vehicle type and the urgency of deployment. Tactical training teaches recruits how to function as part of a military unit. They learn basic squad tactics, how to advance under fire, how to establish defensive positions, and how to respond to orders under battlefield conditions. More sophisticated tactics are reserved for officers and specialists, but every guardsman must understand fundamental concepts like fire and movement, mutual support, and maintaining unit cohesion under pressure. Indoctrination is woven through every aspect of training. The Imperial cult provides the ideological foundation for everything the Guard does, and recruits are subjected to constant religious instruction. They learn prayers and litanies, memorize passages from the Imperial Creed, and participate in regular services conducted by regimental priests. The goal is to create an unshakable faith in the Emperor and his divine protection. This faith is not merely spiritual comfort, it is a practical necessity. Soldiers who believe that their God watches over them will stand firm in situations where rational calculation would dictate retreat. The indoctrination process also teaches hatred. Recruits learn to despise the Xenos, the mutant, and the heretic with a fervour that borders on religious mania. They are shown propaganda depicting the cruelties of humanity's enemies, real and exaggerated. They are taught that anything not human is automatically suspect and worthy of destruction. This xenophobia is not accidental or incidental, it is policy. The Imperium needs soldiers who will pull the trigger without hesitation when faced with alien creatures or corrupted humans. Doubt and mercy are luxuries that the Guard cannot afford. Commissars play a special role in this indoctrination. These political officers, trained in the Schola Progenium and assigned to Guard regiments to maintain morale and discipline, are both inspirational figures and figures of terror. A commissar might deliver stirring speeches about the glory of service and the righteousness of the imperial cause, but they are also empowered to execute any soldier they deem cowardly or heretical. Summary execution is their primary tool for maintaining discipline, and every guardsman learns quickly that the commissar is to be feared as much as respected. The training process also includes the infamous RIP program: retraining, indoctrination, punishment. This is applied to soldiers who have been pulled from the PDF or who come from worlds with martial traditions that do not align with Imperial Guard standards. RIP is deliberately harsh, designed to strip away existing habits and replace them with proper Imperial doctrine. Soldiers undergo this program knowing that failure to adapt might result in reassignment to a penal legion or worse. Education about enemies is provided through the uplifting primer and through direct instruction from officers and veterans. The quality of this education varies dramatically. Some regiments receive detailed briefings on the specific enemies they are likely to face, including tactical advice based on actual combat experience. Others receive only the sanitized and often misleading information contained in the primer. A guardsman might deploy to fight orcs having been told they are slow and stupid, only to discover in their first engagement that orcs are fast, cunning, and horrifyingly difficult to kill. The sanitized nature of enemy descriptions in official materials is not accidental. The Administratum has determined that complete honesty about the threats facing humanity would break too many soldiers before they ever reached combat. Better to let them learn the truth through experience, after they have been sufficiently indoctrinated to keep fighting despite that truth. This policy saves the Imperium from having to deal with mass desertions during training, though it contributes to higher casualty rates in first engagements when soldiers discover that reality does not match what they were taught. Medical training for most guardsmen is minimal. They learn basic first aid, how to apply pressure to wounds, and how to inject stimulants and pain suppressants from their field medical kits. More advanced medical procedures are reserved for regimental medici and field hospitals. The assumption is that most battlefield injuries are either immediately fatal or serious enough to require professional medical attention, so extensive medical training for common soldiers is considered an inefficient use of training time. Survival training teaches soldiers how to find water, forage for food, and shelter from hostile environmental conditions. The depth of this training depends on the expected deployment environment. Regiments being prepared for deployment to jungle worlds receive extensive training in tropical survival, while those heading to ice worlds learn cold weather survival techniques. Of course, the Administratum's predictions about deployment environments are often wildly inaccurate, leading to situations where regiments trained for one environment find themselves fighting in completely different conditions. The final phase of training before deployment involves field exercises designed to simulate actual combat conditions. Recruits practice advancing under simulated fire, responding to ambushes, and maintaining cohesion when subjected to the confusion and chaos of battle. Live fire exercises, when ammunition can be spared, provide the closest approximation to actual combat. Some fortress worlds conduct training exercises that include actual casualties, accepting deaths during training as the price of producing properly hardened soldiers. Throughout all of this, soldiers are constantly reminded of their place in the vast machinery of the Imperium. They are told that they are the hammer of the Emperor, the righteous fury of mankind made manifest. They are assured that their service matters, that every enemy they kill brings humanity one step closer to final victory. They are promised glory and honor, though the reality is that most will die anonymously in battles whose names they never learned, on worlds they never wanted to visit. The psychological impact of this training process is profound. Soldiers emerge from it fundamentally changed from the civilians they once were. They have been conditioned to follow orders reflexively, to trust in the Emperor's protection, and to fear the consequences of failure more than they fear death itself. This conditioning is necessary because the Guard asks its soldiers to do things that no sane, unconditioned person would willingly do. It asks them to charge into gunfire, to hold positions against impossible odds, and to die in place rather than retreat. For some soldiers, the transformation is complete and permanent. They become model guardsmen, exemplars of imperial virtues, serving for decades if they are skilled or lucky enough to survive. For others, the conditioning never fully takes hold. They go through the motions, following orders because the alternative is execution, but internally they remain the frightened civilians they always were. These soldiers often do not survive their first serious engagement, and then there are the majority, who fall somewhere in between. They are changed by their training but not broken by it. They carry out their duties with varying degrees of competence and enthusiasm. They form bonds with their fellow soldiers that sometimes transcend even their loyalty to the Imperium itself. They develop personal philosophies that allow them to reconcile the contradictions inherent in their service. They become, in short, soldiers in the truest sense, professionals who have learned to function in an environment of controlled violence, neither heroes nor cowards, but simply men and women doing a job that must be done. Equipment and the laser gun. When a guardsman completes their training and is issued their standard kit, they receive equipment that represents the absolute minimum necessary for military service in the 41st millennium. This is not hyperbole or exaggeration. The Imperium's logistics apparatus, vast as it is, cannot provide abundant supplies to every soldier in an organization numbering in the trillions. Instead, it focuses on maximizing the number of soldiers it can field by minimizing the resources invested in each individual. The result is a standard kit that prioritizes mass production and reliability over effectiveness or soldier comfort. The laser gun is the foundation of this kit and deserves extensive discussion because it defines the experience of being a guardsman more than any other piece of equipment. Officially designated as the M35M Galaxy short-pattern laser gun, though countless variants exist, this weapon is the most common infantry weapon in the galaxy. Billions upon billions of laser guns are in service at any given time, manufactured on forge worlds throughout the Imperium to specifications that have remained largely unchanged for thousands of years. The laser gun fires a focused beam of coherent light powered by a rechargeable power pack. Each pack contains enough energy for approximately 100 shots at standard power settings, though this can vary depending on the environmental conditions and the specific variant of laser gun being used. The weapon is extraordinarily reliable, capable of functioning in nearly any environment without maintenance. A laser gun can be buried in mud, exposed to vacuum, subjected to temperature extremes, and it will still fire when needed. This reliability is its greatest virtue, and the primary reason the Imperium has standardized on las weapon technology for its basic infantry arm. Within the Imperial military and among some civilian populations, the laser gun has acquired a nickname that reflects both affection and resignation: the flashlight. This term is used sometimes derisively, sometimes fondly, but always with the understanding that the laser gun is not a particularly powerful weapon compared to what the Guard's enemies often field. Against unarmoured or lightly armoured targets, the lace gun is perfectly adequate. A lace bolt will punch through cloth, leather, and thin metal with ease, inflicting a cauterized wound that is immediately lethal if it hits vital organs and merely incapacitating if it does not. Against heavily armoured targets, however, the laser gun's limitations become painfully apparent. Orc armour can often shrug off lace fire, requiring multiple hits to bring down even a single greenskin. The living metal armour of Necrons is squadmates become brothers and sisters in all but blood, bound together by shared trauma and mutual dependence. When one member of the squad dies, the grief is genuine and profound, though it is often buried beneath layers of conditioning and the necessity of continuing to function. However, these bonds can also create problems. Soldiers become too attached to their squad mates and might hesitate to follow orders that will certainly result in their friends' deaths. They might take unnecessary risks to protect each other when tactical doctrine dictates accepting casualties for the greater objective. Commissars watch for these emotional attachments and remind soldiers, often brutally, that their loyalty belongs first to the Emperor and the Imperium, not to their comrades. Romantic and sexual relationships exist within regiments, despite regulations meant to discourage them. The details vary by regiment and by the cultural norms of the homeworld from which the regiment was raised. Some regiments strictly forbid fraternization. Others tolerate it as long as it does not interfere with military effectiveness. The reality is that when you take young men and women, isolate them from the broader population, subject them to constant stress and the ever-present possibility of death, and give them few outlets for emotional connection, relationships will form regardless of what regulations say. These relationships are complicated by the nature of guard service. Partners watch each other die in combat. They experience the guilt of surviving when their lover does not. They face deployment separations when individuals are transferred to different units or when one is promoted out of the squad. The lucky ones find ways to maintain connections despite these challenges. The unlucky ones add emotional devastation to the physical horrors of war. The presence of commissars defines much of daily regimental life in ways that cannot be overstated. A commissar is not part of the regular command structure, though they can override orders from regimental officers if they deem those orders insufficient in zeal or likely to result in heresy or cowardice. Commissars are trained from childhood in the Schola Progenium, institutions that produce the Imperium's most fanatical servants. They are indoctrinated to value victory above all else, to accept no excuses for failure, and to view human life as expendable in service to the Emperor. The authority of a commissar to summarily execute any soldier or even officers they deem cowardly or heretical is absolute. There is no appeal, no trial, no process beyond the commissar's judgment in the moment. A soldier who falters during an advance, who speaks words that might be interpreted as defeatist, who shows insufficient enthusiasm for particularly suicidal orders, any of these can result in immediate execution. The commissar draws their bolt pistol, places it against the offender's head, and pulls the trigger. The body is left where it falls as an object lesson to others. This practice of summary execution serves multiple purposes in Imperial doctrine. It removes unreliable soldiers before they can spread their weakness to others. It demonstrates to the remaining soldiers that cowardice has immediate and permanent consequences. It establishes the commissar as a figure to be feared perhaps more than the enemy, because the enemy might miss when they shoot at you, but the commissar will not. The psychological impact is profound and intentional. soldiers develop complex relationships with their regiment's commissars. Some commissars are respected, even admired, when they lead from the front and demonstrate personal courage that inspires rather than merely terrorizes. These commissars understand that their authority is most effective when combined with genuine leadership that makes soldiers want to follow orders rather than simply fearing the consequences of refusing. Others are purely tyrants, maintaining discipline through terror alone. And these commissars sometimes die in suspicious circumstances during combat, when a stray round happens to hit them from behind. The phenomenon of commissars being killed by their own troops is known but never officially acknowledged. It happens often enough that commissars who are excessively harsh learn to watch their backs during combat, understanding that the fog of war provides opportunities for soldiers to eliminate officers who have become more dangerous than the enemy. This creates an interesting balance. A commissar must be harsh enough to maintain discipline, but not so brutal that their own troops actively seek to murder them. Religious observance permeates regimental life. The imperial cult, the state religion worshipping the emperor as a god, provides the ideological foundation for everything the guard does. Soldiers attend regular services where regimental priests deliver sermons about the glory of sacrifice, the righteousness of human supremacy, and the emperor's divine protection for those who serve him faithfully. They pray before battles, reciting litanies and catechisms that have been taught to them since training. This faith serves practical purposes beyond mere spiritual comfort. Soldiers who believe they fight for a god rather than merely for a government are more willing to die in his name. Soldiers who believe in divine protection are less likely to flee when faced with overwhelming odds. Soldiers who have been taught that the enemies they face are not merely dangerous but fundamentally evil and deserving only of extermination are less likely to hesitate when given orders to kill. The imperial cult is as much a weapon of war as the laser gun, turning ordinary humans into warriors willing to fight and die in situations where rational self-interest would dictate immediate surrender. The priests who tend to regimental spiritual needs vary in quality and competence. Some are genuine believers who provide real comfort to soldiers struggling with the moral and psychological burdens of their service. They listen to confessions, offer guidance based on imperial doctrine, and help soldiers reconcile their actions with their faith. Others are fanatics more interested in rooting out heresy than helping struggling souls, men who see doubt or fear as signs of weakness requiring punishment rather than counseling. Medical care in regiments is functional but harsh, prioritizing getting soldiers back into combat over comprehensive treatment. The regimental medicae are trained in battlefield medicine, skilled at stabilizing traumatic injuries and performing emergency procedures under fire, but they are not healers in any gentle sense. A wounded guardsman is patched up with whatever materials are available, given pain suppressants if supplies allow, and returned to duty as soon as they can hold a weapon. Soldiers with injuries too severe to allow continued combat are evacuated to field hospitals if the tactical situation permits, though many die before receiving such care. The decision about who receives medical evacuation and who is left to die is made through triage, a system that prioritizes soldiers most likely to survive and return to duty. A guardsman with a sucking chest wound but otherwise functional might receive medical attention. One with severe abdominal trauma or catastrophic injuries to multiple limbs might be given pain suppressors and left to die because the resources required to save them could instead save 3 others with better prognosis. This calculus is brutal but necessary given the resource constraints under which the Guard operates. Field hospitals themselves are nightmarish places, understaffed and undersupplied, processing casualties at rates that would overwhelm even well-equipped facilities. Surgeons work for hours or days without rest, performing amputations and emergency surgeries in conditions that barely qualify as sterile. The screams of the wounded provide constant background noise, the smell of blood, burned flesh, and infection permeates everything. Those who survive their injuries and treatment often leave the field hospital with permanent disabilities, missing limbs or scarred bodies that will mark them for the remainder of their lives. Supplies within regiments are always insufficient. The Departmentum Munitorum, responsible for supplying the vast Imperial Guard, operates on scales that defy human comprehension. They must ship food, ammunition, medical supplies, replacement equipment, and everything else required to keep trillions of soldiers fighting across 1 million worlds. The logistical challenges are impossible to fully overcome, and regiments consistently operate with less than they need. Soldiers learn to scavenge, acquiring useful items from battlefields, trading with other units, or simply stealing when opportunity presents itself. A guardsman who finds a better quality lasgun among the dead might swap it for their standard issue weapon. One who discovers rations in an abandoned position will take them without hesitation. Squad mates share resources, creating informal supply networks that supplement official channels. Officers generally tolerate this scavenging as long as it does not interfere with combat effectiveness or cross into outright looting of civilian populations. The acquisition of non-standard equipment creates interesting dynamics within regiments. Some soldiers become known as procurement specialists, individuals with particular skill at finding or trading for desired items. They become valuable members of their units, providing luxuries and necessities that official supply chains cannot or will not deliver. Others become hoarders, accumulating supplies against future need, carrying extra weight but having reserves when others run short. Combat trophies and souvenirs present particular challenges. Soldiers want mementos of their service, physical proof of enemies killed or battles survived. They might take Xenos artifacts, enemy weapons, or other items from battlefields. However, such items can be dangerous. Xenos technology might be contaminated or contain tracking devices. Chaos-corrupted items can literally taint those who handle them, beginning the insidious process of corruption that leads to heresy. Commissars and officers must balance soldiers' desire for trophies against the very real dangers such items present. Time in regiments is structured around cycles of combat and rest, though the duration and frequency of these cycles vary wildly. Some regiments spend months in continuous operations, their soldiers never truly resting, always engaged in combat or preparing for the next engagement. Others might have extended garrison duties between major campaigns, allowing for proper rest and training. The mental and physical toll of these different operational tempos affects unit cohesion and combat effectiveness in ways that military planners must consider when deploying forces. During rest periods between campaigns, regiments engage in training to maintain skills and learn new ones. Veterans teach new soldiers lessons learned in combat. Officers conduct tactical exercises. Specialists practice their particular skills. This training is never as comprehensive as what soldiers receive before deployment, but it serves to maintain basic competency and integrate replacements who might have joined the regiment to replace casualties. The integration of new soldiers into veteran regiments is challenging. New arrivals have not shared the experiences that bonded the existing members together. They do not know the informal rules and relationships that govern daily life. They must prove themselves to be accepted, earning respect through demonstrated competence in combat. Until they do, they are outsiders, kept at arm's length by soldiers who have learned not to become too attached to those likely to die quickly. Promotions within regiments follow patterns dictated by casualties and performance. When a sergeant dies, the most capable soldier in the squad takes their place. When an officer falls, a junior officer or senior non-commissioned officer assumes command. These promotions are often battlefield commissions, granted immediately based on necessity rather than through formal review processes. A soldier might begin a battle as a common guardsman and end it as a sergeant simply because everyone above them in the chain of command is dead. Such rapid promotions create their own challenges. New leaders lack experience in their roles and must learn while actively commanding troops in combat. Their subordinates might resent being commanded by someone who was their peer hours earlier. The new leaders themselves struggle with the psychological burden of being responsible for others' lives, a weight that can be crushing when every decision might result in deaths. Some adapt and become capable leaders, others crack under the pressure, becoming ineffective or making catastrophic mistakes that get their soldiers killed. The relationship between officers and common soldiers is defined by the rigid hierarchy inherent in military organizations. Officers come from different backgrounds, some raised from the ranks through demonstrated merit, others commissioned based on social class or family connections from their homeworlds. The quality of officers varies dramatically as a result. A veteran sergeant promoted to officer status might be an excellent tactical leader who understands the realities of combat and the limitations of their soldiers. A nobleman's son granted a commission through family influence might be worse than useless, issuing orders based on theories learned in academic settings that have no connection to battlefield reality. Good officers earn their soldiers' respect through competent leadership and genuine concern for their troops' welfare within the constraints of military necessity. They make decisions that accomplish objectives while minimizing casualties when possible. They lead from the front, demonstrating personal courage that inspires those under their command. They listen to input from experienced sergeants and specialists, rather than assuming their rank makes them omniscient. These officers become genuinely valued by their regiments, and soldiers will fight harder under their command. Bad officers get soldiers killed unnecessarily through incompetence, cowardice, or indifference. They issue impossible orders without understanding tactical realities. They remain in safe positions while sending their troops into danger. They ignore advice from those with more experience. These officers often do not survive long, as accidents happen in combat, and a bolt round from behind feels the same as one from the front. Officially, such deaths are simply casualties of war. Unofficially, everyone knows that some officers died because their troops decided the regiment would be better off without them. The tradition of fragging, the deliberate killing of officers by their own troops, exists in the Imperial Guard despite all efforts to prevent it. It happens most commonly during chaotic combat situations, where determining the source of fatal wounds is difficult or impossible. An incompetent lieutenant dies during an assault shot in the back. The official report attributes it to enemy fire. The soldiers involved know better but say nothing. The regiment moves on, perhaps with better leadership, and the matter is never investigated unless the pattern becomes too obvious to ignore. Morale within regiments fluctuates based on circumstances, leadership, casualties, supply situation, and countless other factors. High morale makes units more effective, soldiers more willing to take risks and press attacks. Low morale leads to hesitation, reduced combat effectiveness, and increased likelihood of routing when faced with strong enemy resistance. Commissars and officers monitor morale constantly, using various techniques to maintain it at acceptable levels. Victories boost morale, providing tangible evidence that efforts and sacrifices achieve results. Soldiers who capture objectives, defeat enemies, and survive battles feel that their service matters. Defeats and costly Pyrrhic victories drain morale, as soldiers question whether their sacrifices accomplish anything meaningful. When regiments suffer high casualties for minimal gain, soldiers begin to wonder if their commanders value their lives at all, or simply see them as expendable resources to be consumed in pursuit of objectives. The arrival of supplies and mail from home, when it occurs, significantly improves morale. Physical evidence that the Imperium remembers and supports them matters to soldiers who often feel abandoned on distant battlefields. Conversely, the absence of expected supplies or the loss of supply convoys creates resentment and anxiety about whether they have been forgotten or written off as acceptable losses. Entertainment during rest periods helps maintain morale. Soldiers gamble, play cards or dice games, tell stories, sing songs, engage in sports or physical competitions, anything to occupy time and provide distraction from the grim realities of their service. Some regiments have musicians who perform for their comrades. Others organize competitions of skill or strength. These activities build unit cohesion and provide necessary psychological relief from constant stress. Alcohol, when available, is consumed eagerly despite regulations meant to control its distribution. Officers understand that soldiers need some form of release, and generally tolerate moderate drinking during rest periods. Heavy drinking that interferes with military effectiveness or leads to disciplinary problems is punished, but a soldier who gets drunk during off-duty time and causes no trouble is usually left alone. The procurement and distribution of alcohol becomes its own underground economy within regiments, with soldiers trading favours and goods to obtain it. Sexual outlets are complicated by the nature of military service and imperial cultural norms. Regiments stationed near civilian populations might interact with locals, with all the complications that entails. Mixed-gender regiments face regulations about fraternization that are inconsistently enforced. Some commanders strictly forbid relationships between soldiers. Others tolerate them as long as they remain discreet and do not interfere with unit cohesion. The reality is that humans require emotional and physical connection, and regulations cannot completely prevent relationships from forming in high-stress environments where death is constant. The practice of maintaining official regimental prostitutes existed in some Imperial Guard formations during various periods, officially sanctioned to provide sexual release and prevent more problematic behaviour. The current official policy is that such practices are forbidden, though enforcement varies by commander and circumstances. Some regiments maintain the practice unofficially, with tacit approval from officers who view it as a necessary evil. Others strictly forbid it and punish those involved. Contact with alien populations creates unique challenges. Guardsmen deployed to worlds with significant non-human populations must navigate Imperial xenophobia while accomplishing their missions. Official doctrine teaches that all Xenos are enemies, or at best temporary allies of convenience. But soldiers stationed on worlds where humans and aliens interact peacefully might develop more nuanced views, recognizing that not all non-humans are actively hostile. Such thoughts border on heresy, and soldiers must be careful about expressing them where commissars might hear. The presence of abhuman auxiliaries in some guard formations complicates these attitudes. Ogrins, large and physically powerful but mentally limited abhumans, serve in many regiments as heavy assault troops. Ratlings, small and clever abhumans with natural talent for marksmanship, often serve as snipers and scouts. Squats, stocky abhumans known for technical skill, were once common before their civilization was largely destroyed. These abhumans are officially sanctioned by the Imperium and integrated into guard formations, but prejudice against them remains common among soldiers from worlds where such beings are rare or unknown. Life in a guard regiment is fundamentally about survival. Every soldier develops personal superstitions and rituals they believe will keep them alive. Lucky charms carried into battle, prayers recited before combat, specific routines followed religiously, anything that provides psychological comfort in the face of overwhelming danger. These superstitions are tolerated by officers as long as they do not interfere with military effectiveness, understood as necessary psychological coping mechanisms. Veterans become skilled at reading situations and knowing when to take cover, when to advance, and when to keep their heads down. They learn which officers to trust and which to be wary of. They know how to scavenge effectively and how to maintain their equipment to maximize reliability. They understand the informal rules governing their regiment and navigate social hierarchies with ease born of experience. This accumulated wisdom makes veterans dramatically more likely to survive than new soldiers, creating a survivorship bias where the most capable and fortunate soldiers live long enough to pass their knowledge to the next generation. The loss of veterans hits regiments particularly hard. When experienced soldiers die, they take irreplaceable knowledge with them. New soldiers must learn lessons that veterans knew instinctively, often learning through fatal mistakes that could have been avoided with proper mentorship. Regiments that suffer high veteran casualties become less effective, their collective competence degrading as institutional knowledge is lost faster than it can be replaced. This, then, is the reality of life in an Imperial Guard regiment. It is defined by rigid hierarchy, brutal discipline, constant resource scarcity, and the ever-present threat of death. Soldiers form bonds that help them survive the psychological toll of their service, but these bonds are constantly torn apart by casualties and deployments. They live according to routines and traditions that provide structure and meaning in an existence that can seem meaningless when viewed objectively. They serve an Imperium that views them as expendable, knowing that their individual lives matter little in the vast calculations of Imperial strategy. Yet they continue to serve because they have no alternative, and because faith and conditioning have made service their entire identity. The reality of combat. When Guardsmen finally enter combat, all of the training, indoctrination, and preparation they have received is tested against the horrifying reality of warfare in the 41st millennium. No amount of preparation can truly ready someone for what they will experience. the enemies humanity faces are beyond the comprehension of those who have not witnessed them firsthand. The violence is industrial in scale, the casualty rates are staggering, and for most guardsmen combat is an experience that lasts only minutes before they die, contributing nothing more than their corpse to the eventual outcome of whatever battle claimed them. The famous statistic about guard life expectancy needs to be examined because it encapsulates both the horror of their service and the mathematical reality of how the Imperium fights wars. It has been said that the average life expectancy of an Imperial Guardsman in active combat is 15 hours. This number has become iconic within the lore, a grim shorthand for the lethal nature of 41st millennium warfare. The statistic requires context to be properly understood. 15 hours is an average, meaning it incorporates both soldiers who die in the first minutes of combat and those who survive for days, weeks, or longer. The number is heavily skewed by the mortality rate in first engagements, where new soldiers with no combat experience are thrust into battles against enemies they are completely unprepared to face. A guardsman who survives their first few engagements has dramatically better survival prospects than the average, having learned the practical lessons that training could not teach. The statistic also applies specifically to active combat operations, not to total time in service. A guardsman might serve for years, but most of that time is spent in transit between war zones, in garrison duties, or in rest periods between major engagements. When they are actually fighting, when lasguns are firing and people are dying, the 15-hour expectancy becomes relevant. This distinction is important because it means that veteran guardsmen might have years of service, but only a relatively small fraction of that time spent in situations where the 15-hour statistic applies. Furthermore, the statistic varies wildly depending on the specific circumstances of combat. Fighting against poorly equipped human rebels might result in much lower casualty rates than the average. Fighting against tyrannid hordes or chaos space marines results in casualty rates that make 15 hours seem optimistic. The type of warfare matters as well. Static defensive positions where guardsmen can use cover and fields of fire to their advantage are less lethal than offensive operations requiring advances across open ground under enemy fire. The first combat engagement is where most guardsmen die. They have been trained to shoot and follow orders, but nothing can truly prepare them for the sensory overload and psychological horror of actual battle. The noise alone is overwhelming. Artillery fire, vehicle engines, weapons discharge, screaming soldiers, the death throes of wounded combatants. All of it combines into a cacophony that makes thinking clearly almost impossible. Add to that the visual horror of seeing human bodies torn apart by weapons, the smell of blood and burned flesh and released bowels, and the physical danger of being shot at by enemies trying to kill you, and you have an experience that breaks many new soldiers immediately. Panic is the greatest killer of new guardsmen. When someone who has never experienced combat suddenly finds themselves in it, their natural reactions can be deadly. Some freeze, unable to process what is happening, standing in place until enemy fire cuts them down. Others run, fleeing blindly without regard for cover or direction, often running directly into enemy fire or becoming separated from their unit and dying alone. Still others fire wildly, expending ammunition without aiming, contributing nothing to the battle except noise while making themselves targets. Veterans learn to function despite the sensory overload and fear. They develop what might be called combat awareness, the ability to process information rapidly and make tactical decisions while under extreme stress. They know to seek cover immediately, to identify threats and prioritize targets, to maintain awareness of their squad mates' positions and coordinate fire. These skills seem obvious when described, but in the chaos of combat, maintaining this level of function requires mental discipline that only comes from experience or exceptional natural aptitude. The enemy's guardsmen face are the stuff of nightmares, literally in some cases. Orcs are among the most common foes, fungal-based xenos creatures who live for warfare and grow larger and stronger through combat. An orc boy stands taller than a human, possesses strength far beyond human norms, and can shrug off wounds that would kill a guardsman instantly. They feel no fear, charging into gunfire with primitive weapons that somehow work despite seeming to violate basic mechanical principles. Their crude shooters fire inaccurate but devastating hails of bullets. Their choppers can cleave through armor and bone with ease. Fighting orcs requires guardsmen to overcome every instinct towards self-preservation. The only effective way to stop an orc charge is through massed firepower, concentrating enough lass fire on individual targets to burn through their resilient physiology. But as orcs approach, getting larger and more terrifying with every second, the natural human response is to flee. Soldiers must stand their ground and continue firing methodically, despite watching their comrades torn apart by orc weapons, despite seeing the monsters reach their lines and begin slaughtering anyone within reach of their crude blades. Orc warfare is chaotic and brutal. They attack in vast hordes, overwhelming human defenders through sheer numbers and ferocity. Individual orcs might be killed relatively easily if enough firepower is concentrated on them, but there are always more. Always more greenskins charging forward, roaring their alien war cries, trampling the bodies of their fallen comrades without hesitation. Guard formations that break under this pressure are massacred. Those that hold their ground and maintain fire discipline can repel orc assaults, but at horrific cost. The psychological impact of killing orcs is less severe than killing humans or witnessing certain other horrors. Orcs are so obviously alien, so clearly inhuman, that even soldiers with limited indoctrination can kill them without moral qualms. The creatures are attempting to murder you, showing no mercy or quarter. Killing them feels justified in ways that killing other humans, even heretics, might not. This psychological simplicity is one reason that orc conflicts, while physically devastating, cause less long-term mental trauma than other types of warfare. Tyranids represent a different category of nightmare entirely. These creatures are bioweapons, purpose-designed by an alien hive mind for killing and consuming biomass. They attack in swarms that can blot out the sun. Countless organisms working in perfect coordination to overwhelm defenders. Hormagaunts skitter forward on 4 limbs, their scything talons capable of disemboweling armoured soldiers. Termagants provide ranged support with living weapons that fire parasitic organisms called flesh-borer beetles that burrow into flesh. Larger organisms like Tyranid warriors direct the swarms while being themselves formidable combatants. The horror of fighting Tyranids comes from their nature. They are not individual creatures but cells in a vast organism, the hive fleet. Killing individual Tyranids accomplishes nothing if the swarm continues forward. They feel no pain, no fear, no emotion of any kind. They cannot be reasoned with or negotiated with. They exist only to consume, to strip worlds of all biological matter and move on to the next feeding ground. Guardsmen facing Tyranid swarms know that they fight an enemy that views them as nothing more than food, that even in death their bodies will be consumed and their biomass recycled into new Tyranid organisms. The scale of Tyranid assaults defies description. Imagine standing in a trench, looking out across a landscape and seeing movement, then realizing the movement is not individuals but a carpet of living creatures stretching to the horizon, all moving toward your position with singular purpose. The sound of millions of chitin-armored bodies advancing, the shrieking of synapse creatures directing the swarm, the thunder of Imperial artillery trying desperately to thin the horde before it reaches the lines, and knowing that even if you kill 100, 1,000, 10,000 of the creatures, there are millions more behind them. Guardsmen fighting Tyranids often experience a particular form of despair. Against orcs or chaos forces, victory seems possible through sufficient effort and sacrifice. Against Tyranids, victory feels impossible. How do you defeat an enemy that can absorb any level of casualties and continue attacking? How do you win when every dead soldier on your side strengthens the enemy by providing more biomass to be consumed and recycled? The answer is that individual guardsmen do not win against Tyranids. They simply hold the line long enough for heavier weapons, orbital bombardment, or other strategic assets to devastate the Hive Fleet's ground forces. And most guardsmen die in the holding. Chaos presents the most spiritually dangerous enemy. Chaos Space Marines are fallen Astartes. Space Marines who turned traitor during the Horus Heresy or in the millennia since. They are post-human warriors in power armor that has survived for 10,000 years, wielding weapons blessed by dark gods, possessed of combat experience measured in centuries. A single Chaos Space Marine can slaughter dozens of guardsmen before being brought down, and even then, killing them requires concentrated heavy weapons fire or exceptional luck. But beyond the physical threat, Chaos forces carry spiritual corruption. Exposure to Chaos symbols, hearing the words of Chaos champions, or even witnessing Chaos sorcery, can begin the process of corruption that leads to heresy. Guardsmen who survive battles against Chaos forces must be carefully watched for signs of taint. Those who show any indication of corruption, no matter how minor, are executed immediately. Better to kill 100 innocent guardsmen who merely witnessed chaos than allow one genuinely corrupted soldier to spread their taint to others. The demons that sometimes accompany Chaos forces are entities that should not exist in real space, beings of pure warp energy given temporary physical form. They violate natural laws, their very presence causing reality to fray at the edges. Guardsmen facing demons experience existential horror, witnessing things that their minds cannot properly process. Many go mad simply from seeing demons manifest. Those who maintain their sanity must fight enemies that can only be harmed by faith and firepower in equal measure. Creatures that can regenerate from wounds that would kill any mortal being. Chaos cultists, humans who have turned from the Emperor's light to worship the ruinous powers, present their own challenges. They are humans, or were once, making them more relatable than Xenos threats. But they have given themselves over to evil in ways that make them more loathsome than any alien could be. They deface Imperial symbols, commit atrocities in the name of their dark gods, and actively seek to spread their corruption to others. Guardsmen fighting cultists must overcome the disturbing realization that these were once people like themselves, citizens of the Imperium who chose damnation. Necrons are ancient machines wearing the transferred consciousness of a species that ruled the galaxy millions of years ago. They rise from tomb worlds, emerging from underground facilities that have waited in silence for eons. Necron warriors are nearly indestructible, their living metal bodies able to regenerate from damage that would destroy any organic being. Lass fire that would kill a human does nothing to Necrons. Even heavy weapons often fail to permanently destroy them, as damaged Necrons phase out, teleporting back to their tomb complexes for repair. Fighting Necrons is an exercise in futility for standard infantry. Guardsmen can empty entire power packs into a Necron warrior and watch it continue advancing, its self-repair systems knitting back together faster than damage can be inflicted. The weapons Necrons carry are hyper-advanced energy weapons that can reduce flesh and armor to component atoms. A Gauss Flayer, the standard Necron infantry weapon, strips matter away layer by layer, disintegrating targets in seconds. Death by Gauss weapon is agonizing, victims feeling themselves dissolved while still conscious. The strategy against Necrons involves targeting command units and hoping to disrupt their control protocols, causing the warrior automatons to become inert. Or it involves calling in heavy armor, artillery, and orbital support to simply obliterate tomb complexes before Necrons can fully awaken. Individual guardsmen contribute mainly by dying in sufficient numbers to delay Necron advances while heavier assets are brought to bear. It is thankless and horrifying duty, knowing that your role is simply to be expendable obstacles. Eldar, the ancient and declining Xenos race, present different challenges. They are faster, more agile, and more technologically advanced than humans. Their weapons are sophisticated beyond Imperial capabilities. Their soldiers are skilled warriors who have trained for decades or centuries. A Guardian armed with a shuriken catapult can cut down multiple guardsmen in seconds with weapons that fire monomolecular discs at hypersonic velocities. Aspect warriors, specialized Eldar fighters, are even more deadly, each focused on particular forms of combat and achieving a mastery that humans can rarely match. But Eldar are few in number, their dying race unable to field the vast armies that humanity can muster. In battles against Eldar, Guardsmen can sometimes achieve victory through attrition, accepting horrific casualties but eventually overwhelming the Xenos through sheer weight of numbers. The Elder might kill 100 Guardsmen for every one of their own warriors that falls, but if the Imperium is willing to accept those casualties, and the Eldar cannot afford to lose even their own 100, humanity can eventually win. The diversity of enemies Guardsmen face means that tactics and preparations vary wildly. Training might emphasize certain threats based on expected deployment zones, but the reality is that most Guardsmen will face multiple different enemy types during their service. They must be adaptable, learning how to fight different foes with different capabilities and weaknesses. Veterans accumulate this knowledge through experience. New soldiers learn it through watching veterans or through fatal mistakes. Artillery is both a Guardsman's greatest ally and a source of constant terror. Imperial Guard doctrine emphasizes artillery supremacy, the use of massive bombardments to devastate enemy positions before infantry advances. A properly executed artillery barrage can destroy enemy fortifications, kill thousands of enemies, and create conditions where infantry can advance with acceptable casualties. The sound of friendly artillery fire overhead is comforting, each shell representing destruction falling on the enemy instead of on your position. but artillery is imprecise, especially over long ranges or in chaotic battlefield conditions. Shells fall short, hitting friendly positions instead of enemy ones. Guardsmen die from friendly fire as often as from enemy action in some battles, killed by their own side's artillery due to miscommunication, miscalculation, or simple bad luck. The whistling scream of an incoming shell creates terror even among veterans, who know that if that sound is loud enough to hear clearly, the shell is close enough to kill them. They can only throw themselves down and pray to the Emperor that the shell impacts somewhere else. Enemy artillery creates sustained horror. Barrage after barrage falls on guard positions, each one potentially the last thing a soldier experiences. Shell craters become the landscape. Bodies are buried and then excavated by subsequent explosions. The concussive force of nearby impacts causes internal injuries even when shrapnel is avoided. Men go deaf from the constant noise. They develop what would be called shell shock or PTSD in other contexts, becoming unable to function as the psychological toll accumulates. Trench warfare, common in extended campaigns, creates unique horrors. Soldiers spend weeks or months in elaborate trench systems, rarely seeing open sky, living in mud and filth, exposed to constant artillery and sniper fire whenever they raise their heads above the parapet. The trenches become home, a claustrophobic network of passages and dugouts, where thousands of soldiers live in proximity that breeds disease and tension. Life in trenches is defined by cold, wet, and tedium punctuated by moments of terror. Soldiers develop trench foot, their flesh rotting from constant exposure to moisture. They endure lice, rats, and diseases that spread rapidly in the unsanitary conditions. They eat cold rations and sleep in shifts, always aware that enemy infiltrators might breach the trenches at any moment. When attacks come, either defending against enemy assaults or going over the top in their own attacks, casualties are catastrophic. Going over the top, climbing out of trenches and advancing across no man's land toward enemy positions, represents the epitome of guard horror. Soldiers know that the moment they climb the ladder and emerge into the open, enemy weapons will target them. Machine guns, artillery, less fire, all of it concentrated on killing anyone attempting to cross the killing ground. Men die by the hundreds in the first seconds of an assault. Those who survive must continue advancing, stepping over and on the bodies of fallen comrades, maintaining formation despite watching their friends die around them. The only way these assaults succeed is through overwhelming numbers and willingness to accept casualties. The first wave dies, creating corpses that provide minimal cover for the second wave. The second wave dies, advancing slightly further. The third wave might reach enemy positions or might die just short of them. Eventually enough waves have